Welcome to another Introduction to Cultural Anthropology lecture. We continue talking about the family, what is a relative, what is a family. And although we conventionally think about a family as biologically related, right, we often use these metaphors of blood, flesh, bone. Relatedness is also built in other ways, right, through godparenting, for example, a very common one. Sharing parenting duties. Sharing meals might be seen as a form of creating relatedness. Sharing a residence, right? Depending on how long you live with other people, you might consider them your family. You might even spend more time with them than with people who are your family. Spending time together, of course, sharing experiences. For example, being in the army together, doing these sort of things together might create certain connections that look like a family, but because we tend to think about a family almost exclusively as something biological, we don't really consider them to be that strong, right? When in a lot of cases they can even be stronger. So thinking about these questions, right? What is marriage? How do you define marriage? And not in a sort of political way, but like in the arrangement between two people. Do you think romantic love is universal, right? It's something that you can think about, right? Has romantic love always existed, or is it something that has been sort of created through different narratives? And now it seems like it's universal and eternal, right? But is this something that always existed to people? Were people always looking for this idea of their other half, right? What does it mean to think about romantic love? What does it mean to think about love or non-romantic love, for example? So when we think about marriage, for example, marriage is not only the union of two people, right? But in most cases of two families, sometimes perhaps even a little bit awkwardly or annoyingly, marriage is often seen as asymmetrical, right? So both parties are coming into this union, this marriage in the same way, economically, socially, whatever, right? And sometimes we think, right, about marriage as providing this complement, not based only on biological sex, but on social roles, right? How people complement each other, and this is something that we see in different societies throughout history. And if we think that marriage solves a problem, right, what sort of problem are we thinking of solving? And I'll just add something, right? Sometimes when people, as an anthropologist, right, as someone who's part of a discipline that sometimes takes these really specific points of view, right, into really specific culture, but that is also trying to see humanity as a whole from the very beginning, right? When people say, what's a traditional marriage, right? Some anthropologists would say, well, a traditional marriage, if you want to go really hardcore traditional, would be polygamy, right? That would be a man and several women, because throughout history, this has been the most common form of marriage, right? So when we think about tradition and how we think about marriage as solving a problem, what problem, and how we talk about marriage, we also need to think about this long view. So anthropologists, we have been studying kinship since the very beginning, since anthropology first started, right? And the idea of studying kinship or studying family has a lot to do with trying to find some common ground between non-Western and non-industrialized societies that really seem to have nothing in common with Western industrialized societies, right? And this is going back to the middle 1800s, right, to the early 1900s, where anthropologists were first starting to develop the discipline of anthropology. They were going to these faraway places, like you've read, and trying to understand how is it that people can survive without a government. How is it that they're being organized, right? And what they thought they had discovered is this idea of a family, right? The way in which a family is something that organizes people that is different from nature. But at the same time, we all really come from a woman, right? So that connection, it would seem that that's something biological that we all share, right? The rest, like, we can sort of make up and create and interpret, right? But the fact that we all physically came out of a woman, maybe that'll change later on, and it's changing, right? But this is something that anthropologists thought they could build upon to really understand the differences between cultures that looked nothing like their own cultures in the U.S. or in Britain or in France, right? And they also thought that they had find this idea that incest prohibition separates nature from culture. Now, incest can be defined in different ways, right? When we're thinking about incest, anthropologists also want to highlight this is something that's culturally constructed, right? Because in some instances, incest might be defined only through the prohibition to marriage immediate relatives, or it can be defined as second cousins or second cousins once removed, and all of these different things that are really arbitrary, and that shows that it's really a cultural prohibition. That has, it's complicated. It has to do with different sort of exchanges between groups, but we're not getting into that right now. But the idea that when anthropologists were studying other societies, non-Western societies, non-industrialized societies, they thought that they could see the family and really understand what that society was about, right? Especially because these societies didn't seem to have a government, although they did have institutions, just anthropologists couldn't really see them at the time. And they thought that families don't really change, right? And they contrasted that with families in the West, when we think that family, is not very important, it's something that's private. But still, when we think about families in our own context, they're still structuring a lot of what we do, and in a way governing a lot of what we do. So in this article that you read by Jeanette Carson, right, she's talking about in vitro fertilization and Jewish law, and she wants to make clear that in order for you to be recognized as a person of Jewish descent, right, this has to come through the mother, through the matrilineal descent group, right? And in the other lecture I talk about this a little bit, but basically it has to come through women, right? You have to be connected to this Jewish identity through women. So what happens in this example that she's showing, right? If in Jewish law you want to use in vitro fertilization, that means that a man has to masturbate into a cup, right, and has to use that semen to fertilize the woman. But because the act of masturbating into a cup is seen as a sin and thus not sacred, then it loses that it cannot be Jewish, right? So she's sort of analyzing what this means and how these new technologies are affecting how we think about descent, right? And the same thing with Diane Blood's case, right? If she should have access to his deceased spouse sperm, why not, right? And you can read about it in the article. And the other article that I assigned, which is a lot shorter, right, has to do with this idea of polyamory between Dawn, Michael, and Andrea, and whether families that have multiple parents, right, and by multiple I mean more than two in this case, right, can that be recognized? If you have three parents, are there any advantages, right? How is this gonna work out in the future if we think that children and parents are only related biologically, right? Then there's a complexity here. But if we think that, for example, adoption is something that is valid, and we're recognizing that it doesn't require a biological connection, right? Then, like, what's the argument here? If they are involved in the upbringing of the child, if they are loving, right? What's the argument? So just think about these different things, right? How new technologies are going to change the way in which families are created, how new technologies are going to challenge also all conventions of thinking about family that have to do with religion, right? In particular, thinking about in vitro fertilization, but also other things that you can see in some of the videos that I uploaded on Canvas.